Welcome to Season 4 of AIHA's podcast series, The Healthier Workplaces Show, where we explore timely and informative topics about occupational and environmental health and safety to help you improve your workplace. I'm your host, Alejandro Castillo. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with industrial hygienist Enrique Medina. Enrique received both his bachelor's degree and master's degree in biology from San Diego State University. Enrique is the president of Alliance Consulting International, an EHS consulting firm providing industrial hygiene, safety, risk assessments, and EHS management services for corporate, government clients, and organizations in the U.S. and abroad. Enrique is a fellow of AIHA, member of the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, and a member of the American Society of Safety Professionals. Enrique is the editor of AIHA's Technical Guide for Wildfire Impact Assessments for the OEHS Professional. We're here today to talk about Enrique's career in EHS and learn more about how OEHS professionals can assess wildfire impact. Enrique, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to be in here, Alejandro. Thank you.
So let's start from the beginning. How did you discover OEHS and what made you interested in this field?
It was pure luck. I came to study college in San Diego from Mexico. So I was a foreign student. And both my major and my master's degree are in biology. So I wanted to become a marine biologist. And after college, I worked in aquaculture, setting up fish farms in Mexico. And eventually, I moved back to San Diego and I opened my own seafood importing company. The work was great, but I wasn't using my science background. And so there was always something that I wanted to do. And then in 1989, I found that Mexico had enacted some very large environmental laws and regulations. And that meant that American companies that were operating in Mexico were going to have to do environmental compliance work. And being in San Diego, across the border, there was a large American industry presence. So I thought there was a good business opportunity. So I went back to UC San Diego to study for a certificate in hazardous materials management. And one of the required classes was industrial hygiene. And I really liked that class. The professor eventually became my mentor. Dr. Kent Cohen was a CIH toxicologist. And I started by translating material safety data sheets for him. And eventually he hired me. And I don't know if you thought about this, but material safety data sheet, or now we call them SDSs, or safety data sheets, they really encapsulate what industrial hygiene is. You have the chemistry of the ingredients, you have the toxicology of the target organ effects, you have the medical science in terms of your adverse health effects, you also have the engineering controls. It could be ventilation, it could be other hierarchy of control, such as personal protective equipment. And then you also have respiratory protection. Then if you look at the fire safety and the spill control, that's an emergency response aspect. And finally, you have the legal aspect and the regulatory information. So, and it's all designed to make a worker informed about the hazards that they face. So to me, it's just a perfect way to think about industrial hygiene, and I love it.
Absolutely. It's essentially a full circle of information that you were able to learn from.
Yes, definitely.
That's wonderful. I always like to ask each industrial hygienist how they discovered IH or OHS, because it's never, I was chosen for this. It's very much you just kind of discover it. And I always love hearing everyone's responses. And your story is actually very fascinating. That to me is a complete switch. So that's very fascinating. Okay, so next question. Is there a moment in your career that particularly shaped your perspective as an industrial hygienist?
Well, it was actually when I was doing environmental work in Mexico. I was being hired to do compliance work, for instance, to characterize their hazardous waste or to measure their air pollution or their wastewater discharges. But then I started noticing what the workers' exposures were. And by then I knew industrial hygiene. And so I could see in a polishing operation, a worker that is shoveling dust, polishing dust, that has 3 to 4% lead. That's 30 to 40,000 parts per million of lead.
Wow.
And they're using just an ill-fitting respirator. Or I would go to a spray booth and see a worker that was working with a solvent that had methylene chloride, just wearing a T-shirt, no personal protective equipment. And eventually I did some training in Mexico to help people, especially the industry EHS personnel, understand all the environmental and safety implications and industrial hygiene implications.
That's so fascinating. So let's switch up the topic a little bit. What motivated you to specialize in OEHS with a focus on wildfire impacts?
Well, actually, wildfire impacts is only part of my practice. I have a very diverse and in terms of industries, in terms of the kind of work that I do, I do a lot of auditing and environmental health and safety aspects. I also have worked a lot in site remediation, cleaning up contaminated sites, all from the environmental aspect. I do exposure assessments in the traditional industrial hygiene or indoor air quality work, and I also work in greenhouse gas verifications. So in addition to safety work, confined spaces, fall protection, OSHA compliance issues. So it's a pretty broad practice. And people don't know this, but it was 2003 and 2007, San Diego had some major wildfires. One of them burned each of them burned over 300,000 acres. And they also affected what we call the wildland-urban interface, or WUI. And that is where homes are in close proximity to open space.
Of course.
And so in the first 2003 fire, over 3,000 houses burned. In the 2007, there were several hundred. And then we had another fire in 2015 that also burned homes right in the WUI. So I got into it from the side of odor and smoke odor assessment. And that once I started doing that, I started wondering, what would the exposures be to the people who moved back into their homes, the homes that survived? Yeah. And there wasn't a lot of work in that. There was some research on wildland firefighters' exposures while they're fighting the fire. And then we also had background information on indoor air quality unaffected by wildfire. And so I put those two things together, and I did a screening health risk assessment of what a resident would be exposed to or their children. And that was published in the Synergist in 2016. It was called After the Fire, Potential Health Effects from Indoor Air Quality from Wildfire. And in that article, I put an invitation to people who were interested to form a wildfire team. And we got responses from laboratory people, from people that were involved in restoration. And that's what led to the first edition of the Wildfire Guide in 2018. The first one was a solid foundation. It's what we knew at the time in 2016, 17, 18. But we've learned a lot more. And there's 5 key elements that I have that are important in the second edition. And the first one, I'll just list them and then I'll delve into one of them a little deeper. But if we look at it from the industrial hygiene mantra of anticipation, recognition, evaluation, control, and confirmation, the first, the anticipation and recognition is having a conceptual model of a wildfire. And that really boils down to time and distance. How far are you from the wildfire? The second, when we get to evaluation, we're looking at, is this a forensic evaluation to find out the origin and cause of this fire, or is it an exposure assessment? What are the similarities and differences? Another part of evaluation is, what kind of optical microscopy do you need to really identify the particles from wildfire and distinguish them from other things that may be in the background? It could be rubber, from rubber tires. It could be paint chips. It could be other things that are not wildfire related. And then the third thing that in evaluation is data interpretation. Because in industrial hygiene, when we look at exposures to workers, we find correctly that most of them fall into a normal or a log normal distribution, centered around a mean. And that's not the case in wildfire investigations, because you're looking at surface dust and it doesn't distribute itself in a normal way. So we proposed, and we actually developed a data interpretation using probability that makes more sense for that. And that's developed very carefully in the guide. And then the last thing, when we look at the control aspects of industrial hygiene control, that's a restoration. That's how you're going to, get rid of those contaminants. And finally, the confirmation is what we call post-restoration verification, which is another set of sampling and testing to make sure that that what the goals of the restoration were met. And if you allow me, I want to delve a little deeper into time and distance because that is such a key concept.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the distance effect is easier to figure out. If you're at the burn zone, or the impacts are going to be different than if you're in the near field, let's say 1 to 6 miles away, although that's very variable, or whether you're in the far field, which is considered 6 to 10 to 20 to 100, even 1,000 miles away, as we see from a satellite imagery of plumes that go across the ocean. So that, with the effects are going to be different how far you are from the wildfire. The time element is a little more difficult. It has two elements. One is there's a lot of transformations that go on in the smoke plume from a fire, chemical transformations, and a lot of them are driven by decay. What is the decay rate of these contaminants? What is their half-life? So when you think about half-life, you have an initial concentration, and then it takes that half-life to go down to 50%. And then it'll take another half-life to go down to 25%, and so on and so forth. And what we find is that many of the chemical transformations and chemicals that are produced in a wildfire have very short half-lives. It could be hours, days. Some of them are in months, and a few are in years. But by and large, they're short-term. And so when you look at the time effects, there's going to be decay the more time that passes. And the concentration is going to drop. The other part of time is, a fire can, you read about containment. This fire's 10% contained, 20% contained. That means there's still smoke. There's still fires being produced. Right. So there's that time element. Then there's the time when they allow you back from an evacuation zone, and that could be days or weeks after the fire. And then you have to deal with your insurance adjuster. So by the time you get an assessment, you get somebody like me come in and do an assessment, it could be months after the fire. So that element also affects what your goal is, how you're going to approach the investigation, and what you're going to sample, and how you're going to interpret the data. So those are really key elements in investigating a wildfire.
I have to ask, how does somebody know when it's safe to come back home? Are there any safety hazards potentially going back home where it could have been exposed?
Yes, definitely. A lot of it is the distance effect, right? How far were you from the fire? Were you just getting what we call condensed plume or cold plume infiltration into your house? People call it ash. We tend to use char and ash and soot. But anyway, the residues. So that's one aspect of it. And the other is common sense things. What I recommend people do, and what I do when I go into a home, is first you look at the outside. How close did the fire get? Are there any evidence of we call smoke damage on the outside, structural damage also, but also is there what we call thermal damage? Are there evidence, darkened walls or things like that, or the roof? The next thing is there an odor? If it's a strong odor, that can indicate that there's a lot of particulates and that they're off-gassing. And so those would be the things to concern yourself about. And from a worker exposure, yes, if you're a demolition worker or you're clearing the site or collecting the debris, yeah, you are subject to exposure to a lot of the residue that is in the soil or that's in the rubble. And so you need to be protected both from inhalation hazards, skin exposure, as well as ingestion from hand to mouth behavior. And so you need to be very well protected. I call it a level C protection. And if you're just going to a house that survived a fire and you're doing restoration, or you're the insurance adjuster, and in the case of residents that want to see how their house looks, You need to be concerned about possible inhalation hazards. And if there's a lot of
Absolutely.
if there's a lot of odor, I would say even put on a Tyvek and goggles and a respirator to enter your house.
What are the primary health and safety challenges OHS professionals face when responding to large-scale wildfires?
If you are a demolition or recovery worker, then you have the exposure to what is on the debris or on the soil around it, which is the contaminants that burn in the fire. And so you have inhalation exposures, you have skin surface contact exposures, and you also have possible ingestion exposures if there's no sanitation for you to wash your hands. So that's one thing. From the safety side, you have structural damage to the building. You can have heavy machinery or heavy equipment that is operating there. You have those risks. You have also uneven surfaces, trips and falls, possible sharp objects that you can step on. And you also have utilities that are downed, whether it be electrical lines or maybe subsurface gas lines that may be leaking. So those are safety issues that you have to be concerned with. If you're a restoration worker or the IH that is monitoring the workers, then you have the indoor aspect. And for that, they may not be the same safety hazards, but you still have the exposure hazards indoors if depending on the distance and the time that elapsed since the fire.
AIHA looks forward to debuting the technical guide for wildfire impact assessments for the OEHS Professional at Connect 2025, where it will also be part of the conference sale. From May 16th to 30th, purchasers can receive 20% off when using code CONF25. Student members receive 25% off with the same code.
What does a typical personal protective equipment look like for an OHS professional in the field trying to avoid such exposures and harms?
That's a good question. If you're an outdoor worker or you are supervising, you're doing air monitoring or any kind of monitoring, you're the IH or you are the safety officer, you have to wear the same protection as the workers. What does that mean? You wear a hard hat, you wear goggles, you wear a chemical resistant suit, you wear thick gloves with nitrile gloves under them. You wear hearing protection and puncture resistant shoes or safety boots. And then for respiratory protection, I would recommend either a half face or a full face respirator, tight fitting respirator with a combination filter of organic vapors and a particulate filter like an N95 or high. Then as an IH, you will be evaluating what the actual concentrations are and what the exposures are. And maybe at some point you can downgrade from that, or probably in a few cases you may upgrade. Although downgrade is probably the more likely scenario where you say, okay, well, you can use a different kind of respirator, or maybe you don't need hearing protection. There's not going to be any noise. So that comes after the evaluation. If you are a restoration worker, or again, could be an insurance adjuster, it could be an HVAC specialist or an electrical specialist going into a residence, then you first look outside. Are there any signs of structural damage that I need to be concerned with? Probably it will not be the case, but it's good to look. And then when you go inside, you should wear the same respiratory protection that the outside worker wear until you can determine what the exposures are. And you can carry a direct reading instrument to measure the volatiles in the air. And that'll inform you what kind of protection you need. If there's a lot of odors, you may want to put on a Tyvek suit also and goggles until you can figure out what that exposure looks like.
Communication between an OHS professional and an average person may differ a little bit. How can OHS professionals effectively communicate risk and safety information to communities affected by the wildfires?
I've been talking to residents of the LA fires probably from days after the fire started, just to help them understand what they were exposed to and answer their concerns about health and safety for themselves and for their children. And one thing that maybe is not typical, but in these fires, we had a very sizable group of sophisticated, informed residents. Many of them worked at Caltech or at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory or had contacts with UCLA. Mm-hmm. So they almost immediately started forming chat groups and sharing information between them from regulatory agencies, from their own experiences, from insurance adjusters, from industrial hygienists and other people doing impact assessment. And so they were very well informed. And the approach that I think works really well, first of all, explaining what we know about wildfires and structure fires, because there was a combination of them, and use as little jargon as possible, make it understandable, and then also talk about the uncertainties of what we don't know, whether it's because of the specific event or that just the science and the practice has not gotten that far. And one thing that I found very useful is to ask people about their own risk tolerance, because people in this situation feel powerless. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important that they realize that they have agency in the process, and that if you give them information and put it in the context of balancing their fear on one hand with the facts on the other hand, they feel that they can have more decision-making ability. And so on that basis, I think it's important to, first of all, be honest, be frank, talk about things you don't know, and then give them a sense that they have some power to make decisions on their own. And I was getting a lot of questions initially on what was in the air that could hurt them. And so for that, we relied on the Air Quality Index, which is an EPA website that you can check for your community. And so I was helping them interpret what the AQI meant. You know, what does it mean in terms of the total AQI, but also the particulate, the PM2.5 part of it, or the ozone part of it, use them as indicators of what was in the air. And also to use them as basically to understand where they should be, what they should be doing, should they go outside or not, should they allow their kids to play outside. So that was the first level when there was still a lot of poor air quality. Then they started asking about, what should they do first? And that's where we talk about that most of the hazard is in the settled particle, the settled dust from the fire. That's what carries everything. And so that speaks to the importance of cleaning and restoration before you move back in. And then, in fact, we were actually recommending people don't test, just restore it first. You know, we can test later. As I mentioned, there's a post-restoration verification step where we can test after that to see if the cleanup was effective. And so those are the kind of things that, and then people start asking about contents too, you know, and HVAC systems. And so we were talking about those questions too.
Given the increasing frequency and intensity of wildfires, what steps should OEHS professionals take to prepare for the future?
Well, there's three things you can do. One is you become familiar with wildfire impact assessments. And that's really why we wrote the guide, to give IHS and OEHS professionals that familiarity, that knowledge. That's the first thing. The second thing I would recommend is look and try and learn about non-occupational exposure level. And what are the techniques that we use and the methods that we use to develop those levels. And AIHA has great resources the improving exposure judgment set of programs is really good. You have free tools that you can use to assess exposures, and that is available to all members of the AIHA. And then the third thing I would recommend is become familiar with the restoration practices. What are the materials, the devices, the equipment, and the practices that I use in that industry? Because as a impact assessor, one of the things that your report should include is specifications for the restorers to guide them in what they need to do. And that doesn't tell them, to do their job, but what are the specifications the things that we found in the assessment that they should be addressing. And so knowing some restoration practices would also help industrial hygienists.
Now, the second edition of AIHA's Technical Guide for Wildfire Impact Assessments for the OEHS Professionals is soon to be released. What is your approach to authoring and editing this latest edition?
I assume you're not asking about what working with 17 professionals weekly over 18 months resembles herding cats. But the approach that we took was that we always knew that there was going to be a second edition.
Mm-hmm.
The first edition was a solid foundation based on the practice at the time, but there were advances, and that's where we focused on those five elements that I mentioned: the time and distance, the effects of forensic versus exposure assessments, all the data interpretation, microscopy, expanding the section on restoration. And those are the keys that we wanted to add to that, because now there was more science and more practical experience. And speaking of herding cats, the authors of the guide come from industrial hygiene, from restoration, from medical science, from laboratory analysts. There's more than 300 years of combined relevant experience in this group. And so what we did was to break into groups with a chapter leader and then their team. They would put together that, then we would combine it all, distribute it to the whole group, have discussions and get it agreement, and then we form a smaller editing team that went through that and eventually came out with a draft. Then after that, though, was the peer review process. AIHA has a very robust peer review process. So it went through 9 external and internal peer reviewers, and it required 2 more drafts to address the almost 700 comments that we got before AIHA accepted it for publication. So that's how we did it, and I think it came out really well.
I'm looking forward to reading it. Is there a particular chapter or lesson in the guide that you're very proud of or want to talk about or highlight?
Well, more than just what's in the guide, I think I would like to say that when we started, we were meeting, we were just doing our little guide, and we had a deadline of January 31st, 2025. None of us could have anticipated that on January 7th, the LA fires would start and really consume thousands and thousands of homes. And so the guide became very important, both to industrial hygienists, but as well as to insurance industry people and residents. I was getting calls from residents saying, I know you're working on a guide. Can I have it? When is it done? And AIHA really took a leadership position in this. They understood the priority, they understood the obligation of getting this out, and they put all their resources into it. So I would like to commend, Larry Sloan and Michelle Twilley, Tara Laptu, our project manager, was amazing. Then we also had Ala and Lisa in publications, and Jesse in marketing. They all really deserve a lot of credit for getting this document to where it is that I understand that it might even be released in the next couple of weeks. And certainly by the AIHA Connect is their target, and I have every reason to believe that was going to happen.
Absolutely. And I'm sure everybody who you just mentioned appreciates the shout out. Everyone's working so hard to get this book or this guide released.
Yeah.
As we approach the end of this episode, Enrique, is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience?
I think we all know that wildfires are becoming more common. They're also getting larger. They're also affecting more residential areas. And not only from the proximity to the fire, but also from the downstream effects. So this is an area that's going to be increasing in importance, and that there's still a lot of research to be done. And so when we look at a wildfire situation as opposed to a structure fire situation, now we're going to have to combine both of them in some cases. And so I think the last thing that I would want to say is we really need to have more information about what these effects are, and then share it with both the industry and with the public and with the regulatory agencies, because some of the way that they are responding to them, the old models just may not apply anymore.
Enrique, thank you so much for joining us today. That wraps up today's episode of the AIHA Healthier Workplaces show. To learn more, visit the AIHA website and follow us on social media. Thank you for tuning in, and as always, remember that healthier workplaces means a healthier world. Until next time.